everyone, and welcome to the Sewing 101, where I get you started on using your sewing machine. So, I have threaded my machine, I have wound the bobbin. Remember that each machine is different, so you might need to pull out your manual, go through it, get your machine ready. Thereafter, I will take you on just a short process on the steps that you need to get started on your sewing. I'm going to show you how to work out seam allowances, how to actually sew in a straight line, the different important stitches on your machine, as well as how to make your own hem. So once you have those few skills, you're actually ready to sew a garment. I have another tutorial up on an easy top to sew, and I suggest that after you watch this video, you go over to that video and you actually make that top, because this video gives you all the skills you need to make that top. Sewing machine is just a basic starter machine. It has your straight stitches, your zigzag stitches, as well as the buttonhole function. The straight stitches, I have three options. The one is where your stitches are very close together, a medium setting, and one where they are wider apart. So I would use my wider stitches for basting stitches, which is basically when you are wanting to sew something but you're not sure if that's the way you want it to look. So you go over it with your wider stitch, and if there is a mistake, you can just use your seam ripper and it gets undone very quickly. The second one is the stitch that I usually use. If you have numbers on your machine, you can actually just use a 2.5 millimeter, or it's 2.5. And the zigzag stitch is really nice for when you're working with stretchy fabrics, and also if you don't have an overlock stitch on your machine, it's just nice to go over the edges of your seams with the zigzag stitch, which prevents you from having fraying going on inside your seams and just makes it look a lot neater. And then the buttonhole function, which we are not going to look at today, but it is something very handy to have on your machine. This little nozzle assists with reverse stitches, and it's always good and it's very important that whenever you start a stitch, that you do a little reverse stitch in the beginning to start with, and as well as when you're ending, you do reverse stitch. This prevents your fabric from coming undone. And then the tension is very handy for working with different types of fabrics. I've had mine set on 4, which is the standard tension that your machine comes in. I have not ever had to change my tension, so for now, put yours on 4 and leave it there, and yeah, I'm sure that will work for you. I have already threaded my machine. Every machine is different when it comes to threading, so you would have to look at your manual and just follow it. There's also a lot of writings, numbers. Every machine is different. It's always good to remember that when you are threading your machine, the needle needs to be at the highest point, and you can actually just crank the wheel until the needle is at the highest point, and it just helps you with threading. Your bobbin, once your bobbin is in and your machine is threaded, the first thing that I actually battle with is that you need to make sure that these two threads are taken out quite a bit. You don't want to just have a small section, because it makes it harder to stay, and sometimes it just comes off and gets tangled into your other threads. So that is why it's important to actually get a good lot of it out. When you are sewing, you can even pull your machine threads just for the first few stitches until you sew it in and do a reverse stitch. I will show you how to do all of that, but that is just one thing that I learned quite late on, and when I did learn it, it made a huge difference to my sewing. So it's always good to start out just by getting any cheap fabric or pieces that you have lying around, and not actually starting on your actual project when you're learning. Just get 2 pieces of practice fabric, and then we can start. Another important thing to note is that this hand cranking wheel can be turned only towards you. It is very helpful to use this wheel when you are sewing over something that is a little bit thick and you don't want to break a needle, so you could just go slowly and turn your needle. Also, when you're wanting to move your needle to the highest point, you can just turn the wheel until you get it there to your highest point. So that is something that is also very handy to use. On the thrower plate of your sewing machine is usually a few lines where you'd have like your 1/4 inch seam allowance or your 3/8 seam allowance. And what that basically means, your seam allowance is the space that you have left here between your stitch. So on a pattern they would tell you what seam allowance to have, and you can use that thrower plate as a guide. So I'm going to start off by lining my fabrics together. And if there's no seam allowance, what I like to do is just always line it up with the foot of my machine. So I'm going to place this down, and either if you're going to go straight on with your foot pedal, remember to just start off lightly, pressing your foot pedal very lightly. But if you are not sure and you would rather just get your stitches in, you can start off by hand cranking the first stitch. Okay, so I'm just going to do 2 using the wheel, and then I am going to, let me just move this down, hold my reverse button. Some of yours will just have a button, mine is a lever, and I'm going to press on my foot pedal lightly, and I'm going to do 2 reverse stitches, and then I know my reverse stitching is done, so I'm going to sew now all along till I get to the bottom. Now that I've come to the bottom, I'm going to hold the lever down again and do another reverse stitch. Then I'm going to use my hand wheel to make sure that my needle is at the highest point. And once my needle is at the highest point, I'm going to lift up the foot. I'm going to pull out my fabric, and then I'm going to trim off the extra thread. So here you can see I have used my foot as a guideline, and this space over here would be my seam allowance. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my zigzag stitch, the largest zigzag stitch, and let me just turn it to the largest zigzag stitch. You can have a look here. Okay, it's turned to the largest zigzag stitch, and I'm going to go over the edges. So I'm going to make sure that the edge of my fabric is between these two points. I'm going to use my largest zigzag stitch, and with a zigzag stitch there's actually no need to do a reverse stitch. It would hold up pretty nicely. And what this zigzag stitch does is it makes my seam look a lot neater on the inside, and it helps so that my fabric doesn't fray and just make it look all ugly. So let's see how we go. So there you have it, a nice neat finish to your seam. When you are sewing something together, remember that your fabric always has a right side and a wrong side. The right side of your fabric would be the prettier side of the fabric that you want to be shown when you're wearing a garment, or if you're making a bag or a pillow. The right side is the side that you want people to see. So you always remember, as a rule, right sides together, so that when you open up, it just looks all neat and flat. Another important thing to remember when you're sewing is that whenever you sew a seam together, it is always nice to take your iron and press it down. It may seem like an unnecessary step, but when you have a finished product and you have been pressing the seams as you are sewing, it always just gives it a more professional, richer, prettier look, clean look. So that is one thing that I've also learned that does make a difference. It makes a huge difference, more than actually just pressing it with your fingers. Now I'm going to show you how to create your own hem. So what I do is I take a centimeter, which is normally the safest, and you can use your measuring tape, but I can almost just eyeball it. And you fold your centimeter, and then you fold another centimeter. So that is why it's always important to account for 2 centimeters that you're going to use as your hem. So it's one fold, which is a centimeter, and then you fold it again, which is another centimeter. And what I like to do when I'm hemming is also take an iron and just press along this hem to give it a neater look, and it just holds better. You can also use your pins, not a sharp pin. You can use your pins and you can just press that in. If you have wonder clips, those are also great. I have ordered some, but they haven't arrived as yet. Okay, and you just hold them in, and this will hold your hem in place. And then next, taking my sewing machine, I'm going to sew along. It's very important that you sew as close to this fold as possible, not this one, because if you sew on this one, it still has this flap. But if you sew along here, it just looks nice and neat and clean. So let's go to the sewing machine. Another point I want to mention quickly is that whenever you cut your threads, and if they ever get out, make sure that they go in between here, so that they go under your foot, and then that pulled out right back. You'd rather have extra than too little, because remember, it comes up a bit when you're ready to sew. Next, I'm going to place the edge of my hem almost halfway through this point. So here's the middle point, so just a little bit here. And then using my wheel, I'm going to let the needle, make sure I go back to a straight stitch. Make sure the needle goes in. And then I'm going to do my reverse stitch all the way to the edge, and then another reverse stitch.